Hi, I'm Rose, and I am the host of a podcast called Flash Forward, which you probably already know because I'm not sure why you'd be watching this video if you didn't already know who I was or what the podcast was, but just in case you've stumbled upon this in your travels on the internet, and I have been there, sometimes you're watching a video and you're like, how did I get here? If you are in that situation right now, I'm Rose. I make a podcast called Flash Forward, like I just said. It's normally a podcast, not a video, which you'll notice because I'm not very good at doing videos, so bear with me. Flash Forward is a podcast about the future. Every episode is a different possible or not so possible future scenario. So we do everything from things that are very realistic, like facial recognition, antibiotic resistance, a pandemic. Unfortunately, we did that episode 2.5 years ago now. Not my favorite one that has come true of all the episodes we've done. There are over 100 episodes of the show at this point, and we also do things that are less likely than a global pandemic, like what would happen if space pirates dragged a second moon to Earth and the Earth suddenly had 2 moons, which I would prefer to the current pandemic. But unfortunately, I don't get to pick. Anyway, that's what the podcast is. It blends audio drama and reporting, and it's really fun, I think. And the reason that this video in particular exists is that this week is the 5-year anniversary of the podcast, which is incredible, such an exciting thing for me personally. I make the show basically by myself here in my office, and I am so thankful that it has been able to sustain itself and sort of keep going for 5 years. I'm so thankful for the folks who've kept the show going, donors, patrons, listeners, anybody who's ever said anything nice about the show ever in the history of the show. All of you have really kept the show going. So this video is a little bit of an AMA. I thought that maybe one way to celebrate, good time for there to be a siren. Everything's going great. I thought one way for us to celebrate was to do an AMA. So I've gathered a couple questions from patrons and from social media, and I'm going to try to answer them. They are here on my little handy dandy, very old iPad that doesn't work very well, and I'm going to answer them. So I've grouped them into groups because a lot of people have sort of similar questions, so I've kind of grouped them together into little thematic sections. So let's do it. Okay. So Maynard Stanley Mingoa asked how I got started on the path that I'm on now. So how do you become a person who makes a podcast about the future? I had originally wanted to be a scientist growing up. I was like obsessed with Jane Goodall. I think I dressed up as Jane Goodall for Halloween like more times in a row than is like cute or appropriate. And then I learned about Jacques Cousteau, and so I was like, sweet, this is great. My life goal will be to become the Jane Goodall of the sea. That was like my whole plan. I was really lucky. I got to do research when I was an undergrad, and it became pretty clear to me that the actual sort of like focusing on one specific topic that is required of science was not my forte. And so I actually had I was very lucky. I had a very good research advisor at one point who suggested that I try journalism. And so I went to NYU, got a master's degree in science journalism, and pretty quickly after that started reporting on the future. Sort of by accident, I got really interested in prosthetics. And being a reporter who looks at prosthetics, you sort of are exposed to a lot of different kinds of body hacking and these ideas about the future and what the body could be. And at the time, and this was like 6-ish, 7-ish years ago, I didn't see a lot of really, I didn't see reporting about the future that I thought was the kind of reporting that I would want to see, which is sort of like more thoughtful, more critical, thinking about, why are we down this path or not that path, and who are these things made for, and what do these futures really mean? So 5 years ago, Annalee Newitz, who is the founder of IO9 at Gizmodo, an incredible science fiction writer and non-science fiction writer, and you should definitely check out their work, they're amazing. They asked me if I was interested in making a podcast, and I was like, yeah, I had been making podcasts for other places, briefly at the New York Times, and I was an intern at Radiolab and sort of doing all these other little projects. And so I pitched this idea for this podcast, and they were like, yeah, that sounds good. And so I made the first season there, and then after that sort of took the show independent, and it's been going like that ever since. So that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of how I got into what I'm doing now. Okay, a ton of people asked about production process. So I'm going to kind of run through a bunch of these questions. So Mike Korshik asked, how do you figure out who to get in touch with? Jonathan Kahn asked, some of your episodes, or seems like all of your episodes are very well researched. How much time would you say you put into each episode? Brett Giles asked, how long does it take you to produce each episode? Lilian Solcueva asked, what are your favorite methodologies for exploring the future? A couple different patrons, Cranolation, Soonish, Jim Westridge, all kind of asked, like, how long does it take? How many hours does an episode take to make? Kanta Zarandi asked, how do you find your voice actors and actresses? Juan Isaac Mora Hernandez asked, can you tell us about the creative process? So lots and lots of questions about sort of like, how does an episode come together? Also, I'm trying to say your names correctly, and if I don't say them right, if I don't pronounce them right, I'm really sorry. Okay, so let me walk through sort of like how the production process and the thinking process for Flash Forward goes. Not all episodes are the same, so there are a couple of different kinds of episodes. There's the sort of classic, like, just come up with an idea of like, okay, what would it be like if blank, and then kind of go out and try to find people to talk about it. There are ideas that come from listeners. I love hearing ideas from listeners. Some of my favorite episodes have come from listeners because, you know, people who are not inside my brain think of things that I would never think of. And then sometimes it'll be pegged to like a book or something that's coming out. So we have an episode coming up that is pegged to a book that's coming out that I'm really excited about. And I just knew that I wanted to do an episode about just really thinking about this book. And I won't spoil it for you, but it's going to be really cool and really fun. And then sort of building the episode around that. But probably what you're asking, most people want to know, is the production process for a regular episode. Also, I'm going to try to talk a little slower than I've just been talking. I tend to be a really fast talker, so I apologize for that. So I'm going to try to slow down. As I said before, I don't normally do videos. Normally everything is scripted and I just read off a script and I have to remind myself to slow down. So, a regular episode where I would say, okay, what if we all lived underwater? Or, you know, what if facial recognition became totally ubiquitous? Those kinds of episodes. I think about the show kind of having 3 blocks, like A block, B block, C block, and you can kind of hear that when you hear the show. There's sort of the A section, the B section, the C section, and in between those there's usually like a little ad break. And so the way that I tend to think about it is the A section kind of sets up the premise, sets up what do we know about this topic, who is an expert who can tell us about sort of this idea, who can explain, you know, how the algorithm works, or, you know, what the science behind this idea is, or where we are right now with this. And that's the A section, and that's usually pretty easy to find. Usually those people are pretty obvious because they're the people who are doing sort of frontline research on this particular question. The B block usually is like a history kind of block where, you know, if you've listened to the show, you are not surprised to hear that on the Futurist show we talk a lot about history, because I am a firm believer that the future does not emerge fully formed from Elon Musk's forehead. It all comes from somewhere. And so the B block usually is a historian of some kind, maybe, you know, an anthropologist, sometimes a sociologist, talking about sort of how we got to this point. Where did this come from? Where have we seen these ideas before? Have there been success stories in the past related to this topic, or failures in the past related to this topic that we should be thinking about? And so that's the B block. Those people are also relatively easy to find because, you know, often they've published books or research papers or given talks or whatever it is. And then C block is wild card. So C block is sort of like anything that I think about, sort of, that's the like lateral thinking puzzle part of the episode usually. And so that one is really fun. It's a little harder to find because, you know, it takes a little bit of extra thinking, but it's really fun because I get to kind of get into the weird zone of Flash Forward where it's like, okay, well, if we had this, you know, like what would, you know, talking to a lawyer about what would the warranty on a sex robot look like? Like, how do you insure something like that? You know, those are the kinds of things that end up in C block. We have an episode coming up about the end of the world. And in the C block, you're going to hear from 2 different people. One of them talks about the ways in which the end of the world sounds, sort of from like a sound design perspective. Like, how do you actually convey the end of the world in like movie soundtracks or in the sort of like sound element of what does it sound like when the world ends? And the other person you're going to hear from is a party planner about if you were able to, as a party planner, plan the last ever party on Earth. What would that be like? And so that's kind of what the C block tends to entail. So to find those people, I do a lot of reading for A and B block. I read a lot of papers. I read a lot of original research. I read a lot of books, particularly historians often have written a book about it. I also, as longtime listeners know, think a lot about source diversity on sort of all different kinds of axes, making sure that if I'm talking about a topic that is going to disproportionately affect a certain population, to have somebody on the show who's from that group to talk about it, whether that's disabled people, people of color, women, like trans people, whatever, and all permutations therein, whatever that looks like. I try to be really thoughtful and careful with talking to those people and making sure that they're included in the episodes. So that's kind of the research process. And then I reach out to the sources, and it's not that hard to get people to talk to me, to be perfectly honest. I mean, not everyone says yes. People are busy, some people don't want to, some people never respond. It's not like I have 100% success rate, but generally it's actually pretty easy. I think scientists love to talk about their work, and historians get really excited often about being able to kind of use their research in this kind of way, and in thinking through how this can inform the future. Usually it's pretty easy to get people to talk, which has been really exciting. And I'm very thankful for everybody who ever gives me even like a minute of their time. It's really what makes the show possible, is that these experts are willing to talk to me. So that's been really great. And I feel like I've been thinking about this a lot, because for the 5-year episode, I asked all the past guests to record these messages. And I was really nervous that nobody would respond. And I was thinking recently about how grateful I am that not only did lots of people respond, but also the past guests that I've had on the show didn't just respond. They came up with poems, and they wrote little science fiction stories, and they did little comedy bits, and they just they're the smartest, weirdest, most interesting people ever, and I'm just so thankful and proud that they have sort of been gathered up in this place that is the podcast in some way. So, and often they're people who would not normally be in an episode together, right? And I think that's one of the strengths of Flash Forward, is that you're going to hear from experts who maybe would never have met or never have been in conversation with each other in any kind of way. And I think that's kind of the fun surprise of the show. I think that's sort of one of the superpowers of the show, is that it kind of brings these people together to talk about the future in ways that you don't see in a lot of other places or a lot of other contexts. For some reason, it stopped. I don't know why. Video. One person did ask how I found Tamara, Tamara Krinsky, who is in a lot of the episodes. Tamara is an amazing voice actress. I am so lucky that she's been on the show so much. You've heard her on a ton of episodes. Maybe my favorite one is the Mothers Against Digital Danger one from last year. At the end of the season, it was the kind of last ever episode of last year. She plays the mom sort of testifying before Congress about how we need to shut down the internet. And she's just so great. Tamara and I go way back. We both sort of were in the science communication world. Tamara has a group called the Sirens, who are presenters, television presenters, talent for TV. That are also interested in science. You should absolutely look up Tamara's work. She is a host on a show called Tomorrow's World Today, which you can get on Amazon. Okay, I've learned just now from Googling that the SD card in this camera can't keep up with the speed at which the camera is recording, which is why it keeps stopping me. So we're gonna keep it on, and I'm just gonna cut it together, and you're all gonna pretend like this is totally seamless and everything is going great, and that is the present that you're gonna give to me for the 5-year anniversary of my podcast. Okay, so I think we were talking about voice actors, and I was saying that I find them, through various means. That was one of the questions. In terms of how long a single episode takes, that's a great question. I do track my time pretty extensively, just because as a freelancer, it's really important to know how many hours I'm spending on things and how much money I'm making basically per hour, so I can calculate sort of an hourly rate. Flash forward it's a lot of time. I spend a lot of time, obviously I read books for episodes and stuff like that. I probably over-research, to be perfectly honest. I probably could stand to not read several books per episode. but that is not the kind of person that I am, and so here we are. I have tried actually to be really strategic recently about like making sure that I'm not spending too much time falling down rabbit holes, but it's hard because like I think the rabbit holes are kind of what makes the show interesting in many ways, so you gotta balance. Depending on the episode, it sort of depends. Some episodes are easy and just sort of like, I know exactly who I'm going to talk to, they say yes, we do the thing, boom, 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 we're done. And some episodes are really hard and take a lot of time and have me up late at night for many nights in a row before it goes out. And so it kind of ranges, but I would say like an average amount of time each episode would take would be about 80 hours. Which is why they only come out every other week, because they can't come out any more than that. So yeah, that's that. So let's see, let's see, what do you put? Oh, Brett actually asked a question related to this. Brett asked, do you put limits on yourself so that you aren't spending your life getting a PhD in mosquitoes just in case you missed something? And that is something that I struggle with, right? Because like I do want to get things right, but I also kind of like want to understand how things work. That's sort of just like the way that I am. I think that's sort of why being a journalist is the job for me. And so it is really hard sometimes to know when to stop. I think that, you know, partially it's that I trust the experts that I have on, and so I know that they're going to be able to tell me the things I need to know. At the end of every interview, I do this thing that is very common among journalists, but I think many people who aren't journalists don't know, which is that I ask every source, like, hey, is there anything that you think I've missed? Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't talk about? Anything you think I should definitely include in this episode that we haven't gotten to? And that kind of helps cover a couple of my bases, but that way, like, if there is something that is really important that I've like completely missed somehow, usually you have a source be like, hey, yeah, you should actually know about this, or, you know, we should talk about that, or whatever it is. And so that's like kind of a lifesaver question, and I use it for every interview just to make sure that I'm not missing anything. So yeah, it's hard to not overdo it, for me personally, because I'm kind of an overdoing it sort of person. Okay, looking at the other, so that's pretty much the production process. I think that covers everybody's questions about that. I'm gonna go to the next little category, which I have titled in my little document here, superlatives. So things like the hardest, the most surprising, etc. So, Carrie Webb asks, of all the episodes you've done, which topic freaked you out or scared you the most? And of all the episodes you have done, which was your favorite? So I don't have a favorite. It's like picking a child. I have some that are very near and dear to me, but I can't say that I have a favorite episode. Some that I really like are the Under the Sea episode, just because I got to play for you some of those recordings from Sea Lab that very, very few people have heard, which is always really exciting as a reporter to be able to like play you something that, you know, is special. That one was really fun. The Mothers Against Digital Danger one, the one about banning the internet, is one of my favorites because I have been sort of obsessed with that idea for a long time, and it's sort of been mulling in the back of my head for a long time. Which one scared me the most? Man, a couple. I would say antibiotic resistance. I know it's a really old episode now, but that one scares me still to this day. The pandemic one, unfortunately, is quite scary, as we are all experiencing. More recently, I think the one that has scared me the most recently is the one about super advanced CSI techniques, where you could be accused of a crime because your DNA was found somewhere, because they have this really incredible way of detecting tiny, tiny, tiny pieces of DNA now and other sort of chemical traces and stuff like that, that you might have somehow gotten there because you used the same, you know, subway turnstile or something. Like just the ways in which that super sensitive CSI, those tools are gonna end up fingering a lot of people for crimes they didn't commit, and particularly people of color. And it was just really scary hearing that story that's in the episode about Lucas Anderson, who did not commit a crime, but whose DNA was found under the fingernails of the victim because they had used the same oxygen monitor on him earlier and on the victim. So that one I think probably kept me up at night most recently, was the one that was the scariest to me. Okay. Zev Palatnik asks, are there any topics that you avoid or you'll never do? Nothing is like strictly off the table, but there are a few topics that I've really had a hard time with. And mostly because, I want Flash Forward to offer you something you haven't heard before about something. And many of you, are relatively savvy. You keep up with the news about science and technology. A lot of you kind of know a lot about that world. And I don't want to make an episode that you could have just like read in the New York Times. The whole point of the show is to kind of be surprising and interesting and sort of like give you things you've never thought about before. And there are a couple of topics that I've struggled with on that front. The one that's coming to mind is driverless cars. Driverless cars has been requested as an episode for so many years now, and I totally agree that it's interesting, but I haven't quite figured out what like the flash forward version of that future is. Like, what is it that I can say about driverless cars that you haven't already read ad nauseum, right? There's been so much coverage about the sort of like false promises and the ways in which driverless cars sort of like haven't lived up to their potential or have, or, there's just so much out there about them that I haven't quite figured out like what the sort of like weird flash forward take is on driverless cars. So that's one that I think of. It's not that I like won't do it. I don't have like a rule against it. It's just that I haven't figured out like a way to do it in a way that's interesting. So yeah, there's no real rules. I mean, I like, I try not to cover junk science. I try not to cover things that are irresponsible in my opinion, but I think that's not what you're asking. There's nothing that's like fully off the table when it's within the realm of like imagining futures that we do or don't want. Actually, this kind of connects to the next question. A couple of people asked what the hardest story was, what the one that is, has been the most challenging or the most difficult. So Andrea asked which story has been the most difficult. Rainbow Warrior asked, do you regret, any regret? Chris Haskell asked, are there any futures you've hesitated from profiling? The two that come to mind when I think of the hardest episodes, there are two specific episodes that come to mind. And one of them is the episode from last year about animal testing. And that one, I mean, speaking of like third rails to talk about in terms of science and animal rights and testing, that one was really stressful. I wanted to be fair to everybody involved in the conversation. And I think it's one of those topics where both sides make really good points and the truth is really muddy and somewhere in between, right? Like, I think I went into that episode thinking one thing and I came out not like having my mind made up, but sort of just thinking like, oh my God, this is so much more complicated than I even realized. So that one was really hard. That one was really stressful. I was really terrified publishing it because I was really afraid that both sides actually that I talked to for the episode would get mad because I kind of didn't really side with either of them in the end. So far, no one has yelled at me about that episode. Lots of people have liked it. That one was hard. The other one that was really hard, that I was really stressed out about was the episode in the Power mini-season about China. And I'm always a little nervous when I do episodes that are not science and tech, basically, because in science land, I feel relatively comfortable. I kind of know the field. Even if it's, if it's biology, I'm very comfortable. Physics, even that, I kind of know how those worlds kind of work. When we start to get into like politics proper, which is sort of what the China episode was about, that I get really nervous about just because, well, like China has such a long history. There was no way I was going to be able to, like, speaking of, become an expert in China, right? Like, which is a huge place and topic with a very, very long history. It's a place I've never been. It's a place where there is a lot of xenophobia in the scholarship, particularly in the United States, about China. So when you start to look at some of the people who've studied China for a really long time and start to read books about China, less so now, but in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of it is very xenophobic in a way that is not good, obviously. And so figuring out, especially in the context of like when China becomes a superpower, if China overtakes the US, sort of whatever that means, in superpower status, that was really stressful because I am not a political scientist. I don't have really any training in political science. It's a really complicated topic. It's a really hot button topic in many ways. And I was really, really nervous about that one, and about sort of like not falling into tropes about China and not oversimplifying. And so that one was really stressful. I was really worried about that. Oh, Thomas Beckett asked, are there any instances where you as a futurologist feel like you really nailed a prediction? Something you featured in an episode that came about closely the way you presented it? Well, I'm thinking a lot about the pandemic episode recently, which again is not really the one I would have picked to be the one that we got kind of right. I've also been thinking a lot about the episode about fake news, where we talked about a future in which it becomes physically unsafe to travel to certain places because people have eschewed facts and science and sort of reality for alternative versions, which is also something that we're sort of seeing play out a little bit in the United States right now. Which again, like, I would have preferred to be wrong about that. That's not that fun. Those are the ones that I've been thinking a lot about. I also talked about a future in which face masks become sort of a fashion accessory. That was in the context of deserts and air pollution, but here we are, it's happening, sort of. So that one I think about. They're all sort of pandemic related. I've been obviously thinking a lot about the pandemic, as I'm sure all of you have. So those are the ones that come to mind for me. Let's see. Okay, I think those are all the questions in that sort of like category of superlatives, of hardest, most interesting, most surprising. Okay. Media. Oh, a couple of you asked questions about like what I watch on TV and stuff like that. Drew asks, do you watch TV? What kind of TV do you watch? What are your favorite shows? I don't watch TV very much. I find most TV very stressful and overwhelming from like a sensory perspective. I don't enjoy a lot of television. That said, I love Tuca and Birdie, the cartoon. I love that show. I really enjoy soothing shows in which people are very competent. So things like The Great Pottery Throwdown, which is like, if you've ever watched The Great British Bake Off, it's like that, but for clay and like pottery. Portrait Artist of the Year, which is just like watching people paint portraits quite well. I really love that show. I love the show The Repair Shop, which is another British show where they just like fix things. So yeah, my TV consumption is basically just watching people who are very good at what they do that thing well. That is the thing that I enjoy doing. That's the kind of shows I like to watch. Everything else is too stressful for me. I can't handle it. I find television really actually very quite stressful to watch. So I don't do a lot of it. I don't watch a lot of it. So that's maybe not a very cool answer, but that's my answer. Quinn Abrams Vaughn asked, is there an episode that you've been trying to make and just can't find the right resources to finish? Oh, that's a really good question. So it's not a specific episode, but one thing that I would love to be able to do is to report more on futures that aren't quite so US centric. So I obviously live in the United States. Many of the episodes are pretty US focused because that's sort of where I am, and that's the networks that I have and the sources that I can go to more easily. I would love to be doing more episodes that are about places that are not in the US and futures that aren't US centric. But, well, I shouldn't say but, and I'm trying to do those. And I will also say that I want to make sure that I'm doing them in a way that is responsible and good and isn't just sort of like me who knows nothing about a place sort of showing up and being like, gee whiz, look at this. And so I'd love to be able to actually sort of pay local reporters to be able to kind of help me, guide me through an episode or create an episode about a future in the place that they are, where they kind of have all that context, and be able to pay them for that work. And not just sort of be the white lady showing up in places and like, you know, kind of then leaving and extracting those stories for this podcast. So I would love to be able to do that. I would love to have the funds to be able to do something like that and talk to folks in other places about the futures that they're seeing and have them talk to their local networks and communities. But I don't have the money to be able to do that right now. So if I do get the money, you will hear more of those kinds of episodes. And I am trying to do more of those episodes with the resources that I have here. But I want to make sure that I'm doing them well and in a way that is a value add and isn't just sort of like extracting things from a place that I don't know very well. So that's the answer to that. Okay. A bunch of people had questions about like, how do you like think about the world, sort of like world outlook. So, Pierre Baez Ortiz asked, congratulations on the 5th anniversary, thank you. My question is, if there were an NIH or NSF of futurism and you were in charge, which 3 projects would be your top priorities and why? Ooh. Well, right now, number 1 would be coronavirus response and actually funding that. I think public health is the big one that I would talk about and that I would want to fund. Even beyond coronavirus, I think that a really, really well integrated public health research team, not that those don't exist, but I would put a ton of money into those, that was also sort of intersectional in the ways in which race and class and gender all intersect with public health, and sort of have a really big, broad coalition. I think that would be a big thing. I think that is one of the keys to making a better future, is to kind of understand all the ways in which the world as it is currently set up is making people sick. And that is not just pollution or diseases, but also our economic structures and racism and transphobia and homophobia and ableism and all of those things. So a group that kind of was looking at making the world better from that perspective would be my number 1. That would be my answer. Okay. Jared asks, considering all the futures you've explored, what does your ideal future hold? What technologies have we embraced or shunned? What even is our relationship with technology? What social movements have or are taking place? Okay. My ideal future is one in which we learn how to treat each other well, treat each other better than we do now. And I think that sort of speaks to all levels of society, right? Between the interpersonal interactions, between the way, and then all the way up to the sort of like vastly bigger structures and the ways that we interact with each other, mediated by politics and culture and systems. Okay, Drew asks, how do you avoid getting jaded / burnt out? I'm in tech and the industry and news from the world at large can be so depressing, and you're frequently evaluating futures caused by the same underlying systemic issues, racism, capitalism, etc. It's really easy for things to seem helpless and like they'll never get better. Okay, yes, I hear you. It's hard I get it. It's like hard not to feel like the powers that be want things to stay the same, because they do. That is their whole goal, right? And they're quite powerful, and they're very good at getting people to stop asking for a better life. I totally get that. I think, so last year I did an event and I was talking to somebody who is a producer of a media thing that you are probably familiar with, and it is all about the future and often very dark. And I was asking him, I was like, hey, is there anything you're hopeful for? Sort of similarly to this question, like, I was feeling very like, ugh, God, we're totally screwed, And I was like, is there anything, what are you hopeful for? And he said this thing to me, which at the time I was like, that's so weird. And I actually totally feel it right now, which is, he was like, actually, and he's known as a person who basically like comes up with tech dystopias for this show. He was like, actually, I feel really good right now, because for a really long time, the stuff that I've tried to talk about on Flash Forward and he's tried to talk about in his show was fringe, I guess. Like, people weren't really talking about it. People weren't really aware of it. There wasn't kind of the same kinds of conversations you see now about privacy and, equity and... Okay. Last little reset on the video, I think. I also just noticed as I was working on pulling this off the card that it's crooked, so I'll just fix it in post-production. It's gonna be fine. Okay. I was talking about, the fact that, yes. people weren't talking about privacy stuff, and now they are. And so he was saying that he felt better now because people are talking about it. And I actually kind of feel the same way, that like now I feel like there's so much more awareness around things like bias and algorithms, or things like, you know, the ways in which our systems are broken, right? I think there's more and more awareness around privacy and that kind of stuff than there ever used to be. And that weirdly like does make me feel slightly more hopeful, because people are talking about it. People are sort of resisting some of this stuff. Not as much as I would like, but yeah, I think that weirdly I do feel better now that people are talking about all this stuff, even if it's not fixed. I don't know if that's like a good thing, but that's how I feel right now. Okay. Carl Evers asked, amidst all the dystopian futures you've discovered, especially considering that they always involve problems caused by some form of technology, how do you avoid becoming a Luddite? The problem is that, like, it's not generally that the problems come from the technology. It's usually that the problems come from the humans who built the technology. I am not a believer that technology is value neutral and that it's just in how we use it. I don't think that's true. I think that some technologies are negative, right? That like the existence of certain technologies is bad. But I also think that the answer isn't to say that technology should just not exist, right? But instead to say that we should be really aware of the power structures that create the technologies and who benefits, who wins, who loses. So it's actually, I'm not generally tempted to become a Luddite. The thing that is frustrating is that there are companies and products that I refuse to use because of their political stances or because of their past behavior in these places, and it sometimes is inconvenient because other people want to use those technologies, and I'm the one who's like, well, I would really rather if we used an encrypted messaging app. But that's like, you know, it's more of an inconvenience for other people than it is for me personally. So that's really where it comes in usually, is where there are certain products that I won't use, or certain services that I won't use, certain platforms that I won't use because I don't think that they are ethical from a business perspective or sort of from a technology perspective. But I'm actually not really, I don't worry about like technology writ large. I think I tend to evaluate things as they come, and I think most people do too. And I think that's like kind of the right way to do it. Okay, getting to the end of the questions. Where are we on this list? Oh, Carl again says, have you formulated any ideas through the tons of research you've done on how to break the vicious cycle of new technologies solving the problems of past generations of technology? Man, that's a good question. And if I had an answer, I'd be way richer than I am right now. No, I think that this is an answer that's probably, I don't know, maybe this isn't going to feel satisfying, but I think a big thing is to teach technologists, engineers, scientists about history. I went through, my degree is in science. That's what I got an undergrad degree in. And I wasn't asked to learn about history. Not even the history of science, let alone like history more broadly. And so I think that so often you get people, particularly in hardware and engineering and in those fields, but also in biology and medicine and all sorts of sort of academic disciplines, where their training just has not included anything in the humanities about how to evaluate claims, how to think critically, how to find what's come before, how to value things that have come before. I mean, there's a quote from Anthony Lewandowski, who is a former engineer with Google, now in legal trouble for potentially, allegedly stealing secrets, etc. But he's sort of a very wealthy technologist, and he did an interview with the New Yorker at one point, where towards the end of this very long piece about him, there's this quote that he says something like, you know, I don't even know why we learn about history. Nothing that happened in the past matters. I guess it's sort of interesting in the way that like dinosaurs are interesting, but the only thing that matters is the future. And that viewpoint is, I think, the place where this comes from, what you're talking about. And it's just because they're not trained, well, it's not just ignorance, right? Like it's an ignorance that comes from a specific desire to not know, right? It's not like, oh, they're just haphazard, like who, like those poor tech people. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think that a lot of people in the tech world are not trained to learn anything about history, to seek out that information and to understand why it's important to know what happened before. I think that's a big failure of the way that we are educating our future scientists and future engineers and future makers of things. And so that's why you see sort of the same things being invented over and over again. So yeah, I think like mandating that engineers take an history of science class at least, if not a sort of other kinds of history, would be very helpful first step there. So yeah. Okay, are there any questions that I didn't get to? Let's see. No, I think those are all your questions. I hope that I addressed everyone's questions. I have this long list here. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody. Thank you all very, very much for submitting questions, watching this video, which I think now is way too long. I've never done one of these before, so now I know that I should probably pick fewer questions or maybe answer them shorter. I can sometimes talk too much. This is why I usually go off a script. And also why I don't do video, because I'm constantly putting my hands in my face. And yeah, well, anyway, it's the 5-year anniversary of the podcast. Happy 5-year podcast birthday to me. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it was informative or useful or interesting in some way. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.